Ever since the war in Ukraine broke out, there a certain apocalyptical note has crept into a lot of reporting, not just by journalists but by academics, and indeed in policy papers made by public officials, as if the end of the world is nigh, or the world as we know it is nigh, right? I'm not saying that the war in Ukraine and the other wars, the war in the Middle East, these are not consequential events. Of course, they are consequential events. But are they unusual events? I don't think they are unusual events. Conflict or competition, and therefore at least the possibility of conflict, and or very often real conflict, are inherent characteristics of international relations. They are never absent from international relations. It's whether we choose to focus on them or not. It's often said that this war in the Ukraine is the biggest war that has occurred in Europe since the Second World War, and probably that's true. Although there was a small unpleasantness, which is much nastier than this war in some respects, in the Balkans in the mid-90s. Don't forget that. Huh? Much nastier because it was a genocidal conflict. And there has been conflict in the Sudan. There's been conflict in the Democratic Republic, DRC, of Congo. For how many years? Maybe 50 years? Half a century. How many millions have died there? I can't know. I don't know. I was looking up some figures, and now you can only get estimates. Yet nobody cares. Why? Because in Europe, I put it once in a much more crude way, and some European ambassadors were deeply offended, but they could not. No, I don't care about offending them. I said, "Can you refute me?" And they couldn't. I said, "It's only unique in that for the first time in a very long time, not so long if you take for the Balkan Wars, white people are killing white people instead of white people killing brown people or encouraging brown people to kill each other." If you want to put it very crudely, that is what makes this Ukraine war unique, right? He didn't have much to say about that, except he said it's kind of racist. I said, yeah, because, the world is racist. I'm sorry. We don't like it. We should fight against it. But, the factor of race in international relations is a factor seldom discussed. So these wars, we should see them in perspective. Conflict is an inherent quality of international relations. Doesn't make them less horrendous, but we should not think of that the end of the world is nigh. And that brings me to another point of perspective. The world order that seems to be threatened now was never uncontested. When we talk about world order, somehow unconsciously, we think of something that commands consensus. But there is no world order that has ever commanded consensus, total consensus, or even substantial consensus. What we now call, or some countries call, the liberal international order, which, by the way, wasn't so liberal to those who were not in agreement with it or its fundamental tenets, was never uncontested. There was this small unpleasantness called the Cold War. And that was a contest over one conception of international order. And we lived with it. It was often very dangerous. It was very messy. But that was the only order we knew for 40 years or more. It was only a very short, historically exceptional period of about 20 years from the time the Berlin Wall came down to maybe the time the global financial crisis broke out, where one conception of international order seemed unchallenged, but it wasn't really unchallenged. I mentioned the Balkan Wars. That was a challenge. I mentioned the wars in Africa. There was a genocidal conflict in Rwanda, which nobody talked about. And more than that, very fundamental premises of that seemingly natural order of things was challenged by Islamic jihadists in the form of Al-Qaeda and other such things, who challenged not just the premises of their order, but the premises of modernity, culminating in 9/11, the terrorist attacks. Right? Now, that short period, about 20 years or so, was extremely beneficial to most countries in the world, including Singapore, including China, including, I think, I would guess, most of the countries from which you come, right? But this, just because it's beneficial does not mean it is any less exceptional or that it can be replicated. It can't be replicated. What we are seeing today is a return to normalcy. The problem is many of the policymakers or the commentators today grew up, professionally at least, during the exceptional period, and they got very comfortable with the exceptional period and mistake that exception for the norm. And so they are still somewhat discombobulated and yet to find their bearings, right? But, I say this idea of return to the norm not as a counsel of despair. Actually, it's a counsel of optimism and hope. Because all our countries, certainly mine, you see all this out there, all this was developed during that period of contestation. At least the foundations of it was laid, and all the countries that rapidly developed within that contestation. The companies that flourished and grew large also grew up during that contestation. So what we have done before, we can do again, so we should not despair. In fact, I remind people of this perspective as a message of optimism and hope, not of despair. Now, my second point, a broad point, is we often are horrified by the humanitarian consequences of what I said is a normal state of affairs, which is war. Right? And you can see it. You can see it in Ukraine. You can see it, well, you see it, but you don't want to see it in most of Africa. And you can see it, of course, in the Middle East. And I'll use the Middle East as my second example. There's no doubt the war in Gaza is horrific as the attack on Israel on 7 October that sparked it off, right? But let me tell you, there's something about this, and the war between Iran and Israel is also horrific. But all those wars, and one resulted from the other, the Iran-Israel war is a consequence of Israel's war against Hamas. It's one process, and it's not over yet, by the way. This ceasefire is fragile, and it's going to be a ceasefire with Middle Eastern characteristics. In other words, both sides are going to cheat.